of our Equity Summit today that will be beneficial to you all.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Shari Dade. I am the founder and key consultant of Everyday Psychology, which is an organization that focuses on bringing psychology outside of the 4 office walls and believes that psychology and mental wellness can be valuable for everyday people and works best when it spans into the communities that need it the most. I'm extremely excited to be here to talk about some of these topics with you all, and extremely excited to share this virtual stage with 4 of my closest colleagues and esteemed psychologists. So hopefully you guys you're all in for a treat. So I'm excited to be here.
Jennifer, if you could, can you please pull up our presentation? Okay, to our next slide, please. Thank you. All right, so first, folks, good morning. And before I get to the information on the slide, you can read it at your leisure. I'm going to go through a good bit of it. First thing that I'm going to say is, considering the climate that we find ourselves in presently, we want to honor how it is we feel. So the very first thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to make room for however it is you feel in your body. However it is you're feeling in your thoughts, your beliefs, make room for that. And I'm going to ask you to begin to settle those so that we have a space for receiving this information. So I want you to be mindful of any tension that you may be experiencing in your jaw. Just kind of be mindful of it. You may be experiencing some anxiety, some nervousness, some anger. I'm going to ask you to relax that jaw. If your shoulders are tense like I see mine are, Jesus, I'm going to ask you to lower those shoulders a little bit, please. Just go on ahead and relax those shoulders, lower them. Next thing that I'm going to ask you to do is to make room for all of those feelings that you may be experiencing in your chest. Take a deep cleansing breath in through your nose. Hold that for 2. Breathe that out through your mouth. Once again, a deep cleansing breath in through your nose. Notice any anger, any worry. It's okay if it's there. Breathe it out through your mouth. We aren't going to try and chase off feelings. As I mentioned, a part of the conversation that we're going to have with you today is about becoming comfortable with understanding our feelings. And in this moment, as we're making room for those feelings, what we're going to do is to identify what isn't making space for us. And when we breathe out next, we're going to invite those feelings to leave. Just going to invite them to leave. Now, they may return at some point, but just for this moment in this time, as we're making room to receive, on the next breath out, we're going to invite all of those feelings that aren't making room for us to leave. So see them, feel them. Now take a deep breath in through your nose. 1, 2, breathe them out through your mouth. Okay, I know my shoulders are still bunched, so I'm gonna lower them even further. All right, I'm gonna unclench my jaw a bit. Okay, I feel ready to receive. I hope that you do as well. So we're talking about emotional wellness this morning, and what I've listed here are several things that have impacted our emotional wellness in 2020. And I'm going to begin our conversation by talking some about what we can do to really address those things, not necessarily cure or fix, because a part of the difficulty in you doing the work that many of you do is that you get in your head that you need to be a fixer, that you need to repair these things, that you need to somehow have an answer for these things. Regardless of what happens in this election, systemically, this country is still going to have cracks. Systemically, this nation is still going to apply pressure to you and many of the communities that you represent. It is not your responsibility to repair what is broken. And regardless of who wins and when, however many days from now, we are still going to have a profound bit of work that is before us. And we're still going to have responsibilities and obligations, because regardless of who wins, it won't be fixed. We've experienced hope at the beginning in the past and found that we are still fighting uphill. And you realize that. Many of you have been doing your jobs for a long time, and you know that. So of course, we're touching on social justice, political unrest, racism, and supremacy as having an impact. And what I would suggest is that these aren't new things, certainly, and we might believe that they're more in our face and they're more obvious than they've been in the past, when in reality, as we've gotten closer to this election, with COVID being in the background, as people have been stressed, what that stress does is very simply make us more of who we are, right? So in this morning, you brought yourself with you. That stress that you brought with you, that tightness and tension that was in your shoulders, that was you in actuality. That same stress that our nation is bringing with it is what is causing this uptick in many instances of what we think we see. Disturbed routines. So many of you are working from home. We have what is now a conference that we are having and we are experiencing from homes. So consider that. We're in a space right now where we are having to try to adjust to a new reality. We're spending more time having conversations, even in social media spaces, and we're feeling confronted and bombarded by things. Our sleep cycles are disturbed. We're trying to get a sense of how we feel about our mortality amidst a pandemic. We are seeing numbers and deaths which we haven't seen in any instant where we haven't had a war impact our nation. And so that's troubling to a lot of people. Around that idea of mortality is also illness, not just death, but can this happen to me? So there's that sense of worry, right? We have a sense that we are in the same kind of danger that other people are in. It could happen to us, it's around us. And greater still, we often have the sense that many of our neighbors who we see as opponents are in fact making it so that we are potentially going to come to harm. Also impacting us, feelings of being emotionally unwell, disturbances to our adjustment, elevated anxiety, feelings of anguish and helplessness. I'm not going to go through all of these. Essentially, you know these. As I'm saying them, I imagine you are picking out in your life where you have experienced some of these. Waking, feeling COVID-minded. And by feeling COVID-minded, think about the number of days during this pandemic when you've woken up and you don't know what time it is. Even though typically you know what your schedule is, you have no idea what's on your schedule. You're having difficulty determining how you're going to get started. You're having difficulty determining what you want to put on, what you're going to do for work, because your home environment is now being confabulated in many instances with your work environment. Feeling COVID-minded is somewhat feeling distracted, feeling tired all of the time, feeling in many ways unmotivated, right? And what I'm going to say to you and what we're going to discuss with you over the course of our time together this morning is that you can and should feel all of these things, right? You'll notice that I didn't tell you at the very beginning when I asked you to take a deep breath in and breathe that air out that you shouldn't feel these things. Rather, you should feel these things deeply and profoundly because you are sensitive to them. It's a part of what allows you to do your job well. It's a part of what allows you to be an advocate. It's a part of what allows you to effectively work in the communities where you work, is that you are so sensitive to how you feel and to the feelings of others. So considering everything that is happening, you should feel these things. But what can we do about that? To start with, and my colleagues are going to jump in right behind me and they're going to give you more. I'm just kind of getting the car on the road right now. Create and hold space for today's self. So which self do you have today? Is it your playful self? Is it your anguished self? Is it your nervous self? Is it your intentional self? Whichever self you find yourself experiencing today is who you must hold the room for. And by that, you get a sense of what that self may need, and that's how you adjust your emotional environment and your purposeful environment. Establish what your new normal is. Many of us are dying to get back to what our regular routine is, going out to dinner, seeing friends, and we have to establish for ourselves what our new normal is going to be. We probably aren't always going to be in this space, but right now we are. It's that refusal very often to accept it, which brings us to this place of anguish. If we were to look at what our landscape is and to determine how am I going to function within this landscape and make that a goal, chances are you're going to feel a little less anguish. Chances are you're going to feel a little less disturbed in most instances. Reset every hour, disengage, redefine productivity, and reorder and recreate your support system. By those, what I am indicating is that we have to create for ourselves an emotional space, a headspace, an emotional thoughtscape that makes it so that at the beginning of an hour, At the end of a day, when we're interacting with others, we're creating precisely what it is we need. We're giving ourselves meaning within those spaces, not necessarily focusing on things that we can't control, but asserting control by creating a space that we fundamentally need. Okay? We're going to come back to all of these. Right now, talking to you about disturbing the status quo is going to be Dr. April Scott. Jen, next slide.
Good morning again. So to kind of pick back up on with some of the things that Dr. Wells spoke about, I want to discuss disrupting the status quo, because we can't begin to talk about wellness and promoting wellness without discussing the very real and present obstacles that prevent people from being well. It's almost like talking to someone in a burning house and telling them to take a breath while the house is burning down, tell them to take a deep breath. Meanwhile, who is putting out the fire? Why is no one putting out the fire in the house is causing them to cough and to have difficulty breathing in the first place? So I want to talk about how do we put out that fire? Instead of, before we get to the point of wellness, how do we adjust the barriers? And I have a quote here that's taken from the NAP Ministry. If you're not familiar with them, they're a wonderful account on social media that focuses on napping and the benefits of napping, but also from the lens of social justice as well. And one thing that I came across on their page was this quote where you can't book group yourself to anti-Blackness. You're going to have to actually embody this on a somatic level, change and heal. And I think that's a great backdrop for what we are talking about today, is how do we move from theory to practice, from discussing these things in our own circles, but how do we move that into actual actionable steps? So let's start with collective action. And I think what we are seeing this year, what we have seen all of 2020, are the consequences of neutrality and us not wanting to rock the boat, wanting to keep the peace at Thanksgiving dinners and at office meetings where we don't really say anything. And because of that, we have gotten to the place of this extreme where we're now calling things out that they've been bubbling at the surface for decades, and now they have come to fruition. So how do we as a collective, as a group of advocates, as mental health providers, as educators, come together with a common goal? And one way to move to action, one reason why it's important is because it's a way to combat learned helplessness. And we pretty sure if you've ever taken any introductory psych class, you understand what learned helplessness is. It's this phenomenon when humans and animals have been conditioned to endure pain and discomfort to the point where they feel like nothing that they do will help, so they stop trying. And we don't want to get to that point. So one way to do that is to start acting, and acting collectively, because we can get more done as a collective. So one way of finding that action is, where is your sphere of influence? Because individually you can feel overwhelmed, like your vote didn't count, or that the policies are not changing. So what can you change? So maybe looking at who's closest around you. That could be your colleagues, your team, looking at your board of directors. What's the makeup of that? One thing I encourage people to do is to look in the room. Who's not in the room? Who's being left out of conversations? Who's not having a seat at the table? And with that sphere of influence, figure out, where can you act? What does that action look like? And with that, I think it's also important to figure out, when you're assessing the action you want to take, you need to be mindful of the risk and what's the consequences of that action. So I'm not going to get up here and tell you, risk your job because I cannot pay your rent when it comes, or your mortgage when it comes up. But I think you should be very aware of the consequences of your actions, and some consequences you may be okay with because the reward is enough. But I think one thing that we can be clear on is that we have to begin doing something. That the book groups, the task force, the committees, they're not enough if there is no tangible action coming from that. Now, moving on, it's also important to understand how we are all linked together. I think one thing that we have seen is this idea of linked fates, and we don't see other people's problems as coming back to our doorstep. And we are seeing again that what affects one group is going to trickle down and land right in front of you. So we cannot afford to be silent because we are not personally feeling the impact of the pain that another group is experiencing. It is going to end up on your doorstep in one way or another. Now, moving from theory to practice, one way to do this is to begin to challenge the assumptions and homogeneity that's in your field. particularly if you are from a mental health field or even higher education, understanding the systemic racism that's embedded in those fields, and where can you challenge some of those assumptions, whether that's in your policies or even in the way that you interact with your clients. How has racism and other isms influenced your field, and what are some ways that you can slowly start to undo those and challenging them when they come to place? What's the makeup of your board? What's the makeup of your governing body? Are there any prohibitive practices to keep people out of your field? If we're saying, why do we not have enough people of color in this field? Well, let's look at what does it take to get in it. Are there some cost prohibitive measures? So I think that's also important. Again, we have to disrupt the status quo. We cannot continue to do things the same way and expect a different result. Lastly, that self-examination piece. And I think this is an important part. It's also the most difficult part, because I'm going to go ahead and assume that if you signed up for this summit, you probably already have some level of understanding and reflection. Typically, we're probably preaching to the choir. But with that being said, it's also important to be mindful of your blind spots, because the most well-intentioned person still will always have room to learn. So examine yourself, your own blind spots. How have you contributed to some of these systems? One thing I've noticed in a lot of these videos, these viral videos have gone around showing examples of discrimination, is there's usually always witnesses. There's usually always witnesses who are silent and watching the incident take place. And this happens both in these viral moments and even when talking with colleagues who have experienced microaggressions in staff meetings, or students who have had comments made to them where no one says anything, or they may come to them after the fact. So being able to examine yourself and figure out what are some ways that I can step up, what are some ways that I have been complicit in the past, and how can I change that? Also, what is your preferred method of activism? Everyone is not going to be marching and holding signs. Some people have to write letters. You are an amazing writer, that may be your sphere. Some people have the financial means to support a movement or to support a nonprofit. Some people, it may be art, but what is your preferred method of activism? So again, that we can fight against that learned helplessness that makes us feel like nothing we're doing counts. Sometimes it's a matter of finding that proper fit. Also, who is holding you accountable? And how will you know that your actions are actually moving towards the area that you want them to be? These are some important questions to ask yourself. One way to make sure you're being held accountable is to link with other people who share your interests. Join other organizations. Sometimes those organizations have knowledge they can pass on to you about the how to go about with the activism, especially within your field. How will you know when you are finished? And I think this is important because when it comes to things like social justice, who knows what that looks like. But I think it's important for you to have those markers in place so you can celebrate the small wins. So you're not waiting 8, 10, 12 years before you feel like that your work is helping. So maybe it's comforting a student, or maybe it's getting a internal policy changed in your department. Maybe it's hiring more people of color or more women or more gender non-conforming employees in your department. So figure out, what does it mean? How will you know when your work is effective? Also, finally, is rest is an act of revolution. There's an Audre Lorde quote which says, caring for myself is not self-indulgence, it is self-preservation, and that is an act of political warfare. So if we're talking about wellness and disrupting the status quo, you also have to understand that this is a marathon and not a sprint. And it is extremely important that you are taking care of yourself, especially on days like this, how appropriate, this is not going away anytime soon, regardless of the outcome of an election. And you need to have the rest in place so that you can run the race, so that you can not only run it, but run it well and bring people along with you. So that is another key component of knowing when to take breaks, what do those breaks look like, and then so that you can come back stronger when all is said and done. And I'm going to pass it on to Dr. Watson, who can talk more about how to take care of yourself while on the front lines.
You know, it's really interesting that over the course of this past year, I think we all have been inundated with a number of different stressors. Those stressors include, you know, the current election cycle. It includes the pandemic. It includes what I affectionately call COVID-16, 19, and the continued oppression of brown and Black persons. I think the unique challenge of those who support and come to the aid of the marginalized and oppressed groups here in America also experience this traumatization of witnessing and to some degree being emotionally pulled into the experience of the distress that a lot of folks, have continued to experience.
All
And
right,
if
one
we
second,
can
brother. I'm sorry
change
to
the
interrupt.
slide,
Next slide. There you go. Thank you.
and if we can change it, as we change the slide, I found this meme, kind of funny. I don't know if any therapist, any clinician, any person who does the equity work that you all do could anticipate the kind of experience that we would have here in 2020. And as Napoleon so clearly articulated, we have got to make some room and create space for ourselves. I think that in my experience and the work that I've done with my um, organization, ACTA, which is the Association of Clinical Centers Training Directors, uh, as a part of the SCD, or the Standing Committee on Diversity, we've had several discussions, about how we have shown up or how we have not shown up with regards to social justice and doing the work. In fact, one of our charges is to increase the capacity for our body to do the work that we're called to do as psychologists, and to inform our training through the process of making efforts to do the social justice work. But social justice work cannot happen if we are not doing the self work. And so examining ourselves becomes really important and really valuable. And one of the things that I think becomes important is making sure that we have our PPE. Now, I know you guys can recall at the very beginning of this pandemic, there was the question about not having enough or adequate PPE to go around. I think that the medical professionals, the frontline workers, were all complaining and concerned, as we all were concerned about the mitigation of COVID-19, as well as having the necessary resources in order to reduce the potential impact of it. And I think that one of the things that we overlooked and often overlook is mental health. So our psychological protections. What are our psychological protections? What are the things that help us to maintain the capacity to function optimally and work towards our goals, whether it is academically, whether it is socially, whether it is, in any sphere of the human experience. And with the witnessing of these multiple traumatic experiences, I think that it becomes really important for us to kind of take a step back and to kind of really explore ourselves from the perspective of, again, self-care. I was having a conversation with a colleague just last week. She was distressed and saddened and disheartened by yet another shooting of an African-American man who was experiencing a mental health episode. The young man had brandished a knife, and though his mother was sharing with the officers, "Please don't shoot, my son has a mental health issue or concern," that the officers continued to do what we have witnessed and seen officers do. And she was distraught. She was overwhelmed. And not only overwhelmed by the witnessing of this traumatic experience, but also in dealing with and working with the clients that she was working with, some of which who have had exposures to COVID-19, some of which who have questions and concerns, about how to navigate and manage this period of time with increased anxiety, with increased depression, with increased stress. A lot of folks feeling isolated and alone, a lot of folks feeling that they are by themselves in it all and they cannot operate or function well. And so checking our psychological PPE, what does that mean, right? And it derives from this idea of psychological safety, because when we feel safe and we feel that we are able to self-protect against the destructive forces that are surrounding us, we then have the capacity to function a little bit better. We may have a better sense of our own self-efficacy, right? And so our ability to do what it is that we have sought out to do with the sense of being effective. So what Dr. Scott was sharing earlier in her discussion, about some of the questions we might have doing this equity work, right? And then dealing with the amount of empathy overload that I think we all experience from doing this work, that it is challenging, right? Who takes care of those who are taking care of others, right? There was an old conversation and literature, that talks about who heals the healer, because we too are human beings who are experiencing the same pandemic, the same, issues with racism and prejudice and white supremacy that everyone else are experiencing. And so how do we navigate this significant amount of trauma that we experience daily? And as Napoleon shared, how apropos for us to be sitting here in an equity summit on the day where we await for results, no matter who your political affiliation is with, or who your particular candidate is, that we continue to sit with this kind of angst, right, and this kind of worry, about the potential of what could happen, right? There's compassion fatigue that naturally occurs as a result and as a response to the continuous engagement of seeing, witnessing, and being involved in what we are involved in at this particular point in time. And we become so committed and so overly committed to do something that sometimes it becomes paralytic. And it feels like what it is that we are doing, is not enough. And so there's a significant amount of stress. There's a significant amount of de-stress that I think that we all are experiencing. And as equity workers, as persons who are on the front lines to provide for those the, advocacy that is needed, I think it is important for us to take time to do the self-evaluation, the self-care, and develop a plan so that we can continue to move forward in doing the work. We have to change the narrative to the degree that we are able to continue to maintain the level of compassion and empathy that we might need to move forward. And so there is an acronym that I use because that's the way that my brain kind of works, and I call it GRACE, G-R-A-C-E. GRACE comes from the positive psychology research and the positive psychology practice. And it's something that I tend to do every day for myself, because I too am affected by everything that I witness and see, but I still have to show up and support and care for the students that are under my caseload and under my charge, as well as supporting my colleagues and my peers with managing and navigating this challenging time. So GRACE, it simply stands for gratitude, rest, relaxation, and respiration. We began with a breath, right, to help us have the clarity of mind to slow down. We talk about acceptance, right? And we talk about self-compassion or being compassionate, as well as encouraging ourselves to continue to do this work. So we should utilize gratitudes. Research suggests that maybe 3 gratitudes a day can be enough to shift our experience. One of the gratitudes that I use daily is, today is the best day ever. In fact, I have a placard on my dresser that when I go to get a t-shirt or something out of my drawer, I see it. So I am reminded that even though there are challenges today, today is the best day ever. Right? It helps me to continue to work through the day with the stressors that I might experience without losing, some of the positive energy that's necessary to navigate some of the difficult times. So gratitudes, yeah, gratitude can be anything. The sun is shining. I am grateful for it. We've got our first, brisk air for those of you who like fall and cold air from Chicago. And so, I can appreciate the cold air for a few days, but hopefully, in a couple of days, we're back in the 70s or 80s. Then there is rest, relaxation, and respiration, right? taking breaths, taking time to stay connected to ourselves. And that's what the exercise Napoleon introduced us to was about, right? Was to take the moment to be present and to bring ourselves into this very moment. It is okay to rest. It is okay to relax, as April shared the Audre Lorde's quote, right? It is revolution, because most of us tend to go, 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 and go some more. So taking time to take care of yourself by resting, relaxing, and just breathing, whatever that might be, utilizing grounding activities like just paying attention to your senses. The other thing that I would encourage is acceptance, right? Because a lot of times we go against the grain. And if we can learn to kind of radically accept that what is, and continue to put forth the effort and the work without losing the sense of our energy and our motivation to do the work. I think that that helps us to kind of navigate, the negative feelings associated with not seeing things change as quickly as we would like to see them change. And so learning to accept things, bring ourselves into the moment, can help us to begin to deconstruct some of those things that kind of holds us steady and in lock and in a pattern that may be unhealthy for us. The C is self-compassion, because we don't tend to take a lot of time to be compassionate towards ourselves, especially in the work that we do. We are often giving compassion and care to others, but we don't often take the time to do that for ourselves. And so just saying that you are worthy, you are valuable, you are capable of continuing to move forward and do this work, I think is also important. Then encouragement is definitely necessary to keep on moving forward. Sometimes we have to be our own cheerleaders. And so that is my brief acronym for GRACE. Other things that I think is important is developing a self-care plan, have a commitment to it, develop your philosophy of relaxation, whatever that is for you. Make a plan to care for yourself daily. Daily, I take at least 10 minutes to take a moment to step outside in the sun and just embrace the warmth of the sun on my face. It may be for 5 minutes, it may be for 10, but for that moment, I am settling myself so that I can get back into the process of doing the work. Because I wager that most of you have been tied to this computer forever and experience Zoom fatigue. Develop resistance to the distress that you experience by utilizing some of the techniques that you may already have, whether that's watching a little Netflix, or whether that is connecting with friends or family, whether that is just taking a nap like Dr. Scott shared earlier. And then finally, have an accountability partner. These three folks are my accountability partners. They make me better, and I utilize them to kind of keep myself grounded when I am feeling distressed or I'm feeling frustrated. Needless to say, we have to catch our breath. I think that continuing the equity work means that we do just that. And so what Dr. Wells shared at the very beginning is a process that we should continue to do. And so I'm going to pass this on to Dr. Dade, to kind of explore how we can do this as a community, and how to continue to move forward and do the work.
Thank you, Dr. Watson. Can you move to the next slide, please? Awesome. So now that we've discussed the impacts of our current climate on you as advocates, you as community workers, and you've learned a little bit from Dr. Watson about strategies to protect your mental wellness, I think it's important to shift into the mindset of how you should intentionally approach communities that have been experiencing parallel traumas as you. Communities can be places where traumatic events occur, and they can also keep us safe. They can collectively experience trauma, much like individuals do, and they can be a resource of healing. So it's that paradox there. They can be a source of trauma, or they can buffer us against the negative impacts of adversity and trauma. So having a firm understanding of how you are entering the communities as you go back into this advocacy work can play a significant role in the type of impact you leave, whether it's healing or whether it's harmful. So the importance of building resilient and trauma-informed communities is essential to improving public health, but also mental well-being of individuals and communities. And I find a criticalness in talking about resilience because I believe that main component is strength and power. And many of us are living in times, even today, where we feel powerless more often than not. So focusing on how to foster resilience and strength and power is really key as we move back into these communities. Resilience as a standalone term, as many of you probably know, is just that ability to bounce back, to come back to some sort of previous functioning after you experience a severe stressor or a trauma. And so when we think about community resilience, it considers how noticing the community's cultural makeup. So the community's culture, their cultural values, their customs, how this helps individuals and communities overcome adversity. The notion of cultural resilience suggests that individuals and communities can deal with and overcome adversity, not just based on individual characteristics, but from the support of larger factors, especially if that support is trauma informed. And so it's important to know that each community is going to experience and characterize their symptoms of trauma in different ways. It's important to let that community characterize this how they need to, and define for themselves how they've been impacted. So talking about community trauma often helps to normalize and validate the experiences of these communities. As workers, it's important to know that entering a community from a trauma-informed space allows you to first realize how widespread trauma is and that it doesn't have a face. It impacts a various amount of individuals, various communities, and various groups in different ways. So understanding that and recognizing that, and then also being able to recognize the signs and the symptoms before responding. So sitting and slowing and recognizing and asking and questioning and getting information from that community before responding. Because when you respond, it's important to integrate the knowledge that you get from those questions, from that time of stillness, to practice and to actively and intentionally resist re-traumatization or resist doing harm. And so if you've ever done any trauma-informed work, you know that there are 5 guiding principles to enter into a trauma-informed or enter into a space that has been traumatized. And these principles often foster resilience of communities, foster resilience of individuals. The first principle is safety, and it focuses on fostering safety. It focuses on seeking to create a very physical, mental, and emotionally safe space. To foster safety, you're often being challenged to express an understanding and to accept others and individuals and the group's experiences and circumstances, even if they pose a challenge, even if it complicates the work that you're doing. Being able to acknowledge and express and understand those experiences is key to safety. In order to do this, you're probably going to have to enter with multiple intentional interactions with individuals and with groups and engage them in that process. Ensure that the interactions are genuine and that they're focused on building relationships and trust. The second principle is trustworthiness. It's imperative to set some realistic expectations with communities, with individuals as you're doing the work. Don't overpromise so that individuals and communities feel as though they are disillusioned, and that leads to re-traumatization. Oftentimes, if their commitment in the process fails, it can produce re-traumatized groups, re-traumatized communities. So knowing that trust equals behavior over time, groups are going to need to see this process occur in multiple ways over multiple periods of times in order to build that tangible trustworthiness that's needed. When entering traumatized groups, the third principle is empowerment. So empowering communities, empowering individuals takes recognizing the importance of self-determination to engage and to invest, and that everyone can play a supportive role. This often includes inclusiveness, right? So that's the core to community empowerment in trauma affected groups. The process of empowerment often begins when the individuals and the communities feel like they're in control over the changes that they're experiencing. And that leads into that next principle, which is collaboration. Knowing that in order for individuals and communities to feel empowered and to feel in control, there has to be these collaborative relationships and cohesion. It's critical to community building and community healing. Trauma often disrupts the connections and it damages the healthy and the trusting relationships among individuals and among members of groups. And so it's going to be really important to consider strategies for how you can organically collaborate through expressing shared values, through looking at mutual trust building, and through honoring vulnerability. As you move into the work that you do, it's going to be important that you consider this as you collaborate with individuals, as you collaborate with groups towards healing. Next is peer support. It leads right into being able to understand that peer support promotes a sense of hope, a sense of control, and it validates individuals and groups' actions and says that those actions have meaning, they have value. And this is necessary for envisioning for the future and healing and actualizing the plans of healing. And then lastly, being able to understand the history and the cultural impacts that impact groups and impact communities. Many trauma impacted individuals or groups, they lack access to adequate resources and services due to things like structural racism or historical disinvestment. Some of the things that we've talked about that are happening today in our communities. And so it's important to ask yourself, am I keeping this in mind as I move into these groups, as I move into these communities to do the work, to do the advocacy work? Am I carrying this understanding with into my interventions, into the work that I'm doing? So, as Dr. Watson said, after you've taken the time to don on your own PPE, right, that psychological protective equipment, it's going to be really imperative that you take time to understand and to sit with understanding what trauma can do to communities, what it can do to individuals, and how it impacts what you're doing, and to take that into account as you're entering into this work. Ask yourself, are you actively responding and resisting re-traumatization through having a trauma-informed lens? And challenge yourself with one action step that you can commit to this week, that you can commit to today as you're learning these strategies to ensure that your work is trauma-informed and that the communities in which you work are resilient. Thank you.
Jen, on to our next slide real quick, please. All right, so folks, there is our contact information if you want to reach any or all of us. And also now we're going to open it up for questions. Jen, also you have these slides, so I'm going to speak for all four of us and say it's okay for you to forward these to any and all who want to get their hands on them, okay?
I will do, absolutely.
Okay, so I think we had some questions that popped up, is that right?
So I have one.
Okay.
So Natasha Pauling, who is our friend from, works with AARP here in South Carolina, asked, how can we feel seen and connected even in our solitude?
No, excellent question. I'll dive in and then I'll let one of my colleagues here jump into it as well. I think being seen in solitude requires that, well, first, we narrate solitude differently. You know, instead of seeing it only as solitude, what I choose to view it as is an opportunity for connection. So I now have all of this space around me and I can determine for myself who I then invite into that space. And that requires that we then become more even social media public. You know, am I willing to, with my friends who I have here, everybody in this group, right? Napoleon Wells on all social media. You need to reach out to me because I got some shit to say to all y'all every day. So I'm demanding that you come in with me in that space because I have to have that contact. Wait, I want to see what shit looks like in ASL. Say it one more time. Okay, she did it there. But a part of what we in fact have to do is to go about the business of projecting ourselves into those spaces and to let others know that we need them in there with us. Also, I think just affirming ourselves, kind of saying, I have a right to be seen on a given day with whoever myself is on that day. However messy I am, let me find what parts of my support system can connect with that. If I'm feeling intentional, let me find whatever parts of my support system can connect with that. A lot of being heard, being seen is about finding ourselves and then projecting it into spaces where we can share.
Anyone else want to respond to that?
Only thing that I thought about with the question is feeling seen and connected is also an issue of the heart and not necessarily about how many other people you are physically touching, although we do know the power of physical touch. So I think examining or being intentional about the quality of the people and the quality of the reach out. And it doesn't, because we are in a situation where we can't physically touch and be around as many people, looking at what does my heart feel like when it is connected to another thing. For me personally, music is a great way for me to connect. I can sometimes feel like I'm connected to the writer if they're saying something or singing something that speaks to my spirit. My drive to work this morning had my own concert because that's how I felt seen and connected. It may be a book, maybe a writer. So I think because we are in such restrictive conditions, being able to think outside of the box when we think about connection and being seen is also helpful.
Thank you. What other questions might our friends who are with us today have? You know, something that while we're waiting, that one of you said, I mean, you all were just so brilliant, and thank you for your words and the feelings behind the words that you shared with us today. I personally really needed it. But one of you spoke on the fact that this work is ongoing, right? And I actually screened a film for a group that we're working with. They work in the field of athletics. And so we watched this film called A Long Time Coming, about this 1955 Little League game that was and Napoleon is nodding his head, in Orlando, Florida, between a black team and a white team. And that, you know, several teams in Florida would not play the black team, but the team in Orlando, the white team in Orlando would. But they interviewed Hank Aaron to talk about, you know, his memories. And one thing he said that really struck me is, and I'm going to get it wrong, and Napoleon can correct me, but the number of home runs he had, right? He said, I had hundreds, but I didn't get them all in one day. And I didn't get them all in 1 year. And that really kind of stuck with me, that, you know, it takes persistence. So I've got a question, a question here from Charles Weathers. I witnessed several low trust environments, some at the relationship level, organizational level, and the community level. I'm also witnessing a lack of willingness of leaders to help restore trust. Can you talk about leaders restoring trust in situations, especially if they feel they, quote, weren't there when the trust was broken? Seems like this aligns with the trauma comments from Dr. Dade.
Dr. Dade, you on that one? Go for it, please.
Sure. Yeah. And one of the things that I hold, and I mentioned during that presentation, is trust equals behavior over time, right? And so trust is a very delicate thing that takes time to build. And oftentimes I believe that we assume that trust is something that is just taken up because we offer it the first time. All right. So we say, oh, you know, you should trust me. You should trust my intentions. You should trust the person that I am and how I'm bringing this to you. And oftentimes that's simply not enough. That's not how trust works. And so it takes intentional efforts over periods of time. It takes intentional acknowledgement of the impacts of being in a mistrusting community, being in a mistrusting organization. And I often talk with organizations about organizational trauma and how it is really about recreating culture. And that takes a multitude of experiences, a multitude of intentionality, intentional behaviors from individuals, from groups, from leaders, but also from individuals who are working day to day, kind of on that ground, doing the work. And so it's not necessarily something that can happen over time. I appreciate that comment, Jennifer, about it's not a one time thing. It takes time, it takes intentionality, but it also takes someone that can help lead a group through that process. It's really hard to build trust in a space where individuals mistrust one another. And so having someone come in and say, how do we do this piece by piece, bit by bit, is really important. Being able to have someone come in from the outside to do some of that work can often help with rebuilding or navigating that process of rebuilding trust.
I want to piggyback on what Dr. Dade has said, and I would suggest that I've seen trust often built in spaces where those who are in power, or those who are involved, or those who may be elevated in some way are willing to be a co-conspirator. So if you're willing to actually break some of the rules on behalf of those who are vulnerable, if you're willing to, in many ways, kind of commit the crimes necessary to destabilize the system so you can advance their agenda. And very often, a lot of the trust is built when people are willing to be humble, when they're willing to actually kind of sit knee to knee with people who need it most. You know, instead of saying, you can trust me and look at what I'm doing, show me what you are doing right next to me in spaces where I can see it, where I am available to create a language. And as Dr. Dade said, create a culture. And we go about the process of showing that we both have skin in the game. But if you are in an elevated position, demonstrating that you're willing to put more skin in the game so you can take this system that clearly has bred this distrust and then begin to destabilize.
I think we have time for one more question. So the people on this panel are working psychologists and have clients today. Who I'm sure needs you as much as we do. Okay, so how do we create a cultural shift? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. And so how do we avoid just doing something rather than doing something effective?
I think when thinking of doing something effective, what lens are you coming from? How are you defining effective? So it's going back to that outcome. What are you hoping to see? And understanding that culture shift does not happen overnight. So sometimes the work you're doing, you may not even see the end of it. So being able to make sure that you're recognizing those small incremental changes is important. So shifting culture is, what are the actions? What is it going to look like along the way so that you're not, I call it death by task force. I cringe now anytime I hear the word task force, because sometimes that's where ideas go to die. So how are you going to make sure that the things that you're talking about, the strategy, it's being implemented? So putting a timeline on it, being clear again about the outcome measures. Also part of, I think, with cultural changes, it starts also with policy and language. Even if you look at, I think cigarette smoking is a great example of how we saw a cultural shift, and some of it came with language and education and policy. You have to have consequences for certain things. Otherwise, people are going to continue to do it. So I think focusing on those areas, but also being very clear about what's that incremental change going to look like, and having the accountability of, if you've given me this task or I'm going to do it, I need the resources to implement it, as well as we are putting a timeline on it again, so that it doesn't just get stuck on those strategic task force and committees.
I'll say my 2 cents relatively quickly, because I know that we have to wrap up. We have to focus on hitting the short marks. Sometimes those long, goals, if we put it in the perspective of, let's say, shooting archery, right? Most of us are shooting for that 50-meter goal, right? And along that 50-meter goal, there are 10 meters, there are 5 meters, there's 20 meters. And sometimes focusing on hitting the 10 and the 20 along the way is more important than focusing on the long-term goal. Any change that we ever will make will have to endure time. And time in the process of what changes within that time and within the context of that time is important to also consider. And so focus on maintaining a resolute frame of thinking with regards to those short meter goals. Hit the 5 meter first, hit the 10 meter first, you know, and along the way, we will find that we have built towards creating culture change. And so those are my 2 cents. And I love you guys, and I have to bid you farewell.
Thank you all so much. I'll be in touch because I want to work with you all. So one of those short meter goals, I do have to say, as a daughter of Mississippi, we woke up this morning with a new flag. And it took a really long time to get here. And it took a lot of work by a lot of people, but culture change, right?
Yeah.
So thank you all. And we will hopefully be in touch soon.
Oh, we are going to work. We love you guys. I love
Thank
all
you
of you on the panel and every single one of you folks that joined us today. I hope you have an amazing rest of your day. Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
all.
Absolutely.
Take care of yourself.
So friends, we actually have a break now until our next panel, which is at 2 o'clock, 2 o'clock this afternoon. And so we'll be back here ready to go. And let me know if you have any questions. We'll see you soon. Much love to all of you. So I will see you all in a couple of few hours. Have some lunch.